Well, thank you. And we want to recognize the Clallam County EDC and the North Peninsula Building Association and Kitsap Bank for helping us get this launched, for this series. This is the second series that we've done for Clallam County. And we really appreciate our presenters and our participants. And today's event is really the cornerstone and the capstone of any foundation. We have Graham Ralston here first thing this morning. And Graham is a local hometown guy out of the Olympic Peninsula. And he is from Ralston Law. And today he's going to talk to you about contracts and resolutions and disputes and everything else that's attached to that. And after Graham, we will have Vanner Construction Management on deck to go over bidding and estimating. So with no further ado, Graham, if you're ready, we'll let you have the floor.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Leslie, for that introduction. Thank you to the SBTRC, the EDC. Thank you for pulling this all together. Today's presentation is on contracts, dispute resolution, and claims, more the legal side of this bonding education program. I want to stick in your mind, think avoidance first. And let me get my slide working here. Okay. And Leslie shared that I am a local kid. I grew up in Port Angeles. My family's been out there for over 100 years, but I went to undergrad at University of Washington and law school at Seattle U. Before then, eventually I went to work in Washington, DC for the US Department of Transportation and spent about 7 years close to this field where we were doing bonding education programs, small business training, resources, procurement, technical, and financial assistance. I now run my private law firm on the peninsula through Seattle. I'm an attorney and a CPA, so I like talking legal, finance, tax. I really like to problem solve any client solutions, but I look at my law license and CPA license as just additional tools to help solve those problems. I did put in the chat, just as a reminder, this presentation is being recorded for anyone that joins later. Anything that you do ask or share on here is not confidential, but I do encourage you to ask questions. I love engaging with participants during the presentation. So if there's part of this presentation that, even if it's not applicable to you, you don't want to give an exact factual scenario about yourself, please feel free to speak up. And someone from the team here will relay the question onto me during the presentation. So as we talk about contracts and avoidance of disputes, what I want you to think about is we don't want to be in contractual dispute situations. We want to avoid them in the first place. But it's still important for you to understand everything that goes into your contract, be empowered to understand what you're signing, and hopefully you can head off any issues that could arise from that contractual relationship. Well, what are some things that you can do from the start that could help you avoid any of those issues? One, treat people with respect and build good relationships. Read everything that you signed. You're taking a good step by coming here today, becoming empowered to better understand the contracting process. Understand that not every contract is a win for every company. This is unfortunately where we would see most small business owners, especially in the construction field, go under, is they're so excited to sign that first, second, or third contract or that big contract that they don't understand all the terms that are in there. Maybe it's the financing or how they get paid out. Maybe it was an issue that happened down the line and all of a sudden one wrong contract shut that company down. I'm not trying to scare you at all because it's good to be entrepreneurs and to move forward, but it's also you also need to be balancing that with understanding what you're signing and being smart about it. And start start with solutions first. We're going to talk about some of the grievance processes in this presentation, but you should always look at your first option as, you know, catching catching more flies with honey rather than vinegar. So thinking about how do you create more solutions as you potentially run into problems in your business life to avoid very costly litigation or other issues. So keep that in mind first as we go through all this, that this is all designed to empower you to be educated in the process, and so that you can always think about avoidance of disputes first, and that you're starting off on the right foot, and that you're being proactive and not reactive in the process. I see there was a couple chats. Are there any questions kicking this off, or is that people just saying hi?
It's just mostly saying hi, but
Okay.
Lori Fazio from Clallam EDC is on board, and if we can interrupt you for just a moment,
Yeah.
Graham,
Yeah,
we'll
of course.
let Lori say hello.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Good morning, Graham. I am working from home this morning and I was having some technical difficulties getting on the call. So I know that Colleen and Peggy should be joining here shortly. So I don't mean to interrupt your presentation. We're just really glad that you took the time to be on the call and to present this educational piece to everyone.
Of course. Well, thank you for hosting today and this entire series for us. We appreciate it. And when they jump on the call, I don't have the chat or participants open, so feel free to interrupt me at any time.
Will do.
All right. Well, here's an outline of what we're going to cover today. And this presentation is also going to be shared in the overall workshop or Dropbox that's being organized. So there are going to be some specific clauses that are included in here. I'm not going to be reading everything word for word, but this is also designed to be a good reference tool for you in the future. This isn't just today's presentation. It's designed so that you have something to reference and that you have an outline. So in the future, if you're signing your first contract, or maybe it's your 10th contract, and now you're just learning a little bit more, that if there's a certain clause underneath price and payment that you see in this presentation, I'm not saying that you should put that in there exactly, but you should be comparing. You should be thinking about some of this in that process, and you should be educating. And this is a good refresher as a tool. I don't expect anyone to master this from today's session, but just getting a better sense of what you should go back and be looking for before you sign those contracts. So let's go ahead and jump into understanding those contract provisions. So it's absolutely critical to have copies and to understand all the contents of the documents that are incorporated into the contract. Well, what does that mean? All the documents, what does that mean? Maybe it's your bid. Maybe there's plans and specifications. There's a schedule. What about insurance? So the contract that you sign might reference 3, 4, 5, 6 other documents, and make sure that whatever documents are being referenced, that you also have complete and full copies of, because whatever you end up signing, you're going to be beholden to that. And you're not going to be able to go back and say, well, I never received Exhibit A or Exhibit B. If you're signing that contract and you're agreeing to those exhibits, you need to make sure that you have full and complete copies, because that is included in the entire contract that you're actually signing. One of those items that we talked about is the scope of work. Similar to your bid a little bit that you're developing is, what are you actually going to be providing that prime or that general contractor? And how are you providing it? What hours during the day? What are the specifications for that scope of work? It's important to be detailed about this. The more details you have in any and all these documents, the less potential for confusion or disputes down the line. And this is another example of being proactive and not reactive. That as you set these terms ahead of time, you're really establishing the rules of the road for the relationship. It's not just for the GC. It's not just, and when I say GC, that's general contractor. It's not just for that that GC, and it's not just for you. It's for the both of you, so that you're both in agreement on what can happen, on what should happen, and you're reducing any confusion or friction down the line. We just brought up bid terms, that's similar a little bit to your scope of work, and maybe those bid terms of what you're proposing should actually be included in your subcontract. And here's an example of those terms, the first example that you're going to see, that potentially you want to use some of this language if you want your exact bid language incorporated into your contract that you're going to end up signing. What about payment? This is also another major issue where we see small businesses run into problems with GCs and primes that a general contractor, we're going to talk about this later, may not pay a small business owner until 60, 90, 120 days down the line. And if you're getting paid out 120 days, do you think that your employees want to wait 120 days to get paid? No. You need to have sufficient cash flow to make sure that you can manage all of your employees that are currently working for you. And you need to proactively plan that what happens if your GC is going to be late on those payments? Do you already have a line of credit established? Are you taking on jobs that don't stretch you too far? Meaning that if you're a two-person operation and you're normally doing 500,000, that you don't just stretch to 2.5 million in the next year without any kind of capacity growth built in there, meaning that line of credit that could maybe support delay in payments from the GC. So these are things that you should be thinking about: is how frequently are you going to be paid? What's the penalty on some of those interests on if payments are late? There are federal rules. So if you're thinking about working on a federally funded contract, those jobs are required to pay out within 30 days. Now, I understand the issue of small businesses wanting to maintain good relationships with their primes, but it's important to communicate with your prime at the same time and say, hey, we're a growing company. Make sure that this is in your initial contract. Make sure that there's fair understanding from the start that this is a really important part of you running your business. And if you don't express that, then going back to your GC down the line, if they're paying you out in 90 days and you're on the brink of going under because you're not getting paid, now you're in not a great position of leverage in communicating with that prime. This is a little bit more into detail of what we just talked about, meaning paid if paid, that the GC that you're working for, you should be looking at this in your contract, where it could potentially say that they're not required to pay you until they get paid by the prime. And what happens if that prime is having issues making payments and is going to be 150 days? Well, now that GC isn't required to pay you for 150 days as well. This is why it's important for you to be looking at this type of term in your price and payment, that you set up your net term of potentially 30 days, that when you're looking at the bottom down here, you need to think macro level, who has the deepest pockets to withstand longer periods of not being paid? Is it the small sub? Is it you? Or is it the larger GC? The GC, by doing paid if paid, is trying to shift their burden of payment onto you, onto the small company. And that's not fair to you. And that's something that could really hurt your company as well, and what you should be looking for in that payment. So make sure that the GC owns the risk of non-payment, and make sure that that GC is paying you net 30 of the invoice. And maybe that when we say net 30 of invoice, you should be looking at your contract of what is it an approved invoice? And if it's an approved invoice, well, what does that require? And are you meeting all the conditions for that and what are you agreeing to ahead of time in that process. I know we've just covered some things in depth. I'm just going to do a quick check and also grab a quick drink of water. Do we have any questions coming in?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
You were just talking about pay if paid,
Mhm.
and I've had several experiences with that in my career. And that's basically just for progress payments, is it not? You can still lien the property and still have a claim overall, but it just is, it applies only to when the general contractor gets paid. And at the end of the job, if the general contractor never gets paid, you still have the right to lien the property. Isn't that correct?
You're correct in that, but I want you to think about this process, that if you're a small business owner and you don't have a lot of, you don't have a line of credit or you don't have substantial cash flow, how long does that process take to go make a claim, to follow through with the lien and actually collect on that collateral? And can your small business survive that process? And who's covering the legal fees? You might be successful in court and you might, your legal fees might be covered, but that could also, your company might not be around at that point. So
I understand. And let me share just a
Yeah.
short story with you on that front, and don't get offended because of some of the details of the story. I got into a contract with a gentleman that presented himself as a college professor. As it turns out, he did that at night, but his primary business was a lawyer. And he set me up. And we got into a beef on our project because he got 3 payments behind in our payment schedule. I left the job. I thought I was okay leaving the job because I hadn't been paid. I felt, if you're not going to pay me, I'm not going to do any more work. So we got into a legal dispute. And what I learned was that is a civil matter and it hadn't been adjudicated. And I was still obligated to honor the terms of my contract, to perform. So what I learned was that it's very advisable to have the financial wherewithal to perform a job start to finish without getting paid, because potentially there is that risk. And if you don't have that financial wherewithal, you can be in a world of hurt. So from that point forward in my career, I made sure that I could undertake any job and perform it without receiving a penny should I run up against that kind of condition again. So that's just a big warning to people about how you can be forced into bankruptcy.
Yeah, thank you for being open about that and sharing your story, because it gives a good real world example of what we're talking about here, of having the cash flow, or what we talk about capacity, meaning even if you don't directly have the money, proactively planning and thinking about a line of credit that your company could potentially pull on. So in terms of being able to perform the full length of that contract that you need to perform on, and if something goes wrong, you've already got that line of credit to help you get through, making a claim on that collateral and selling it and getting your company in a good position. Whereas if you haven't already set up that capacity for your company and then you try and do it when you actually need it, it might be too late for you.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks again. And if you have more stories, please feel free to speak up and share. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we're next on to schedule. So what does it mean for, let's say, when you're agreeing, we just talked about approval of invoices, that your contract might specify each part of the job might need some kind of approval, and your contract might require some kind of substantial completion, final completion, or early completion that would trigger then payments for you. And these are all connected throughout the contract, and something that you need to be reading and understanding. And just because we define substantial completion here in this presentation, you need to be looking in each one of these contracts. There also might be a glossary or term sheet. So whatever you read or learn today in this presentation, you should also know that some of those terms could be defined slightly differently in accordance to that contract that you're agreeing to. So make sure that you're even reading specifically what those terms mean. It's really, unfortunately, you know, the sometimes lawyers make things too complicated in contracts when plain language would suffice for most people. And it's like putting together this puzzle. And that puzzle is understanding all these different terms. And once you get those definitions, how are they fitting together throughout these different parts of the contract? So make sure that you're understanding once again, all of those terms and where they fit within that contract in your schedule. Go ahead and require a consult that throughout this process that you ask your general contractors to provide you a schedule and attach it to your subcontract. And once again, this helps set that path forward for both people proactively to be agreeing on how things should be executed, and put things like notice in there that if there's going to be any changes to the schedule, that maybe it's going to be 30 days notice or 15 days notice, and that you don't get a single day's notice on scheduling, because that could really change or impact your ability to be performing on other jobs and how you're assigning or designating labor. And if there's going to be a change in schedule, are you going to put some kind of penalty, not necessarily penalty, but additional cost in there? Be thinking about all these different things that could impact your company, and don't give a GC or a prime complete control over your company without protecting yourself with terms to make sure you're compensated for any of those changes. Like we
So,
talked about.
Graham,
Yeah. Yep.
this is Leslie. We have a question here from Teresa.
Hi, Teresa.
And she wanted to know about stop work provision.
We're going to get into stop work. It's going to come up. So once we get to that slide, if there's still a question on it, then we'll make sure that we go directly back to her. Is that fair?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great. So changes, claims, and notice. Before any work is performed, make sure that you have a complete understanding of that contract, reinforcing that. And the majority of these contracts include changes clause, similar to what we were talking about, a change in the schedule. What about changes in scopes of work? Make sure that it's not just a unilateral, that it's a decision that could just be made unilaterally by the GC. We just talked about that. Don't give them complete and unilateral power over you. Make sure that changes need to be agreed by you, and make sure that there's provisions that would compensate you for those changes and are providing you adequate notice. Claim notice, if there's something wrong in that contract requirement, that the contractor make a written request or claims within a specific time frame for additional compensation or time for completion. Now, going back to that contract again, if there's a 10-day requirement and you don't make that claim within 10 days, well, guess what? You may have just waived your opportunity to make sure that you're compensated for that. And I know that you got in maybe into the construction business because you love building things. You love to be outside. You like to watch things go up, and reading these contracts are probably your least favorite thing to do in the world. Or is at least part of your business. But for you to be able to still go out and do that thing that you love, make sure that you're understanding these processes so that your business is viable. And it's incredibly important for you. If you need a flag, so if you've got a 30-page contract, maybe for that contract, you're just going to pull out 1 page worth of highlighted notes, right? You're going to create an outline for yourself that maybe says, I need a 10-day claim period. I need a 20-day notice period here, and just high-level bullets that, going back to that 30-page contract, anytime you have questions is going to feel burdensome and potentially overwhelming to read over. So that first time you read it over, create an outline for yourself. That's a quick point of reference that you've got the most material points and parts of understanding pulled out of there. 3 hurdles in that claim process: written documentation of the entitlement and cost backup to support the claim. Make sure that you're documenting everything, that you're following the contract claim resolution procedures. And then once again, be aware of those waiver provisions that we just talked about. Indemnification. This is most often, most people see this with insurance companies. That's the easiest example of what this term means, that someone else would step into your shoes to make you whole or to take the place of you, similar to a bonding company that may step into your shoes and take the place of you in that process. You could also be responsible for people working for you or subs working for your company. And you want to make sure that in those contracts that you're signing, or that you understand what you're signing with those GCs, that you're not stepping into the shoes of anyone else except for what you're directly negligent for. Once again, I don't expect you to master or remember all these terms. This is a point of reference. So if you see this term in your contract, come back here, reference this PowerPoint slide as a quick stop point of guidance.
So Graham, this is Leslie again.
Yeah.
Geezer has a question about, does email documentation qualify as notification?
Good question. So it depends on what the contract states. If the contract states that you must provide written notification or written notice and delivered to a certain address, then emails do not qualify as that certain notification. Now, parties can agree to electronic notice instead, but make sure that you understand exactly what those terms are. If it just says written notice in that contract, then yes, I would consider that email to qualify as that written notice. But if it says written notice and delivered to a physical address, then I would not expect an email to serve as that written notice, absent any kind of agreement outside of there. I know it's technical and it doesn't make a lot of common sense. And unfortunately, our judicial system complicates things, our legal system. It's something that I wish that we could change about some of this. Understanding some of the damages that are within these contracts. So there's 3 different types of damage categories. There's actual, liquidated, and consequential. Actual damages are designed to put you somewhat back into your original position of where you would have been for the injury that you suffered. So cost of labor, your direct cost for labor and materials, let's say. Liquidated damages are usually a clause within the contract that specify a penalty that, let's say you didn't do something by a certain date and you're going to owe $10,000 in liquidated damages. That would be on top of your regular actual damages. And then consequential damages are actual damages were your direct labor or materials. Consequential would also be factoring in, let's say, your profit. So that margin that you would have expected a certain amount of profit at the end of the day by performing on that contract. So those are your some of your different damage remedies in terms of recovery of monetary funds. That's different in terms of, let's say, like specific performance, which is an equitable remedy. We're not necessarily getting into that, or injunctions to stop building. More often than not, you're going to see some of these economic civil damages if there's a contract dispute.
Graham, this is Geezer. I have a question on the liquidated damages.
Yeah.
contracted for many years outside the state of Washington, and I'm still learning some of the nuances and differences between the legal aspects of doing business in Washington versus where I was doing business. And in the state where I was previously doing business, liquidated damages went both ways. For instance, if there was a clause that said that if you're late by 1 day, then you would be penalized X amount of dollars per day for every day that you were late. But in order for that clause to be effective, it went the other way also. So if you were 1 day early, you were entitled to that same monetary amount per day you were early. Is that the same thing here in Washington?
Well, that's an interesting, the way that it's phrased. Yeah, so you gave two different examples of what we'll call damages. Liquidated damages are more of a penalty. And I would look at what you're talking about being early as a performance bonus. I wouldn't typically see that being called a liquidated damage. And it's typical that I would see something like that in a contract. We would just have a different term. So the late side is a liquidated damage, but on the early side, that would be a incentive bonus or performance bonus. And I wouldn't typically see that ever be called a liquidated damage clause to get paid a bonus. If you've seen something like that, I'd be happy to take a look at it for you outside of this call, pro bono. And, I'd be interested in seeing that because I haven't come across that before.
Well, like I said, it was in a different state. In order
Okay.
for the liquidated damage clause to be effective, it had to work in both directions. Otherwise, it was nil. It was worthless.
Oh,
But
so
that's why I asked, because I'm here in Washington now.
yeah, and so liquidated damages also do need to be reasonable. So you couldn't put, for $100,000 job, you couldn't put a liquidated damage at $500,000. It would just get thrown out. It needs to be proportional to the actual damages and being reasonable with that. But I haven't seen anything that requires a balance in the state of Washington, similar to the example you provided.
Thanks.
Once again, I'd be happy to look at anything though, pro bono outside of here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Craig,
Yeah.
Graham, Craig had a note that it stated, what does the contract say? And then Larry Bjork says that we called this a penalty bonus clause. So can you address both of those?
So, yeah, can you hear me? So when I say, what does a contract say? Anytime there's a question on a project, my first question is, have you read the contract and what does the contract say? First thing you got to do, if the contract talks about liquidated damages, or does a contract talk about early completion bonuses? Two different things. I've never heard of a early liquidated damages. 35 years, never heard of it. So yeah, if there's something in another state, I'd love to also see that because I've just never heard of it.
Yeah, and I might pile on for just a minute. I know it's not our turn to talk yet, but this was an interesting question, Geezer, that you raised. In all the years that I was a contractor, we had liquidated damages clauses, and that was very common, especially in public work. From time to time, you'd have a penalty bonus clause, which is exactly what you described. If it's $1,000 a day if you're late, that it's $1,000 a day if you're early, and that was certainly good for the contractor. It gave him incentive to finish early. But I never saw that as a part of an LD clause in a contract. It was always a separate provision. And generally, liquidated damages clause don't come with that bonus clause unless you can negotiate that with your client.
Thank you both very much. Appreciate that.
I like the group discussion. This is good. Should I continue, Leslie?
Yes, please do.
Okay.
We have about 8 minutes until our next presenters are due up.
Okay. I'm gonna I'll speed up just a little bit, and I'm not going to cover some of these technicals in some of these clauses. Termination of your contract. And once again, for everyone, maybe you've joined late. This presentation is being saved. It's a point of reference to come back to. So you're reading through your contract. You come up on termination. You need a refresher. Come back to the presentation. See, what are we talking about? What should you be thinking about and asking yourself as you review this contract? What if the GC needs to terminate the contract? What should those terms be for termination? It shouldn't just be for convenience at the GC level, that there should be some kind of trigger or condition, what we call a condition precedent, something giving rise to that termination, and specifics for what would give rise to that termination, and potential for that subcontractor to still recover if there's termination. And what could you recover on? How could you potentially dispute? Here's a bunch of different terms that you should be looking at as you're thinking about what should you still be reimbursed for if there is some kind of termination. And if there is, how soon should you be paid? If there is termination, should you be completed on, or paid on completed work within 15 days, 30 days? And once again, when we say completed work, what does that mean? Approved invoices, right? Make sure that there's clear language around what is completed, what's approved, as we talked about earlier in the presentation. The last part of this presentation discusses a little bit more of if there's contract breakdown, if there's breakdown in the contracting process between you and the GC, or let's say it's a subcontractor with you, typically it's going to go to mediation, which you would usually want. Going to court, and once again, civil disputes can become extremely expensive with attorneys. Not only extremely expensive, but stressful. You got to think about your mental health here. And mediation can be a good avenue for you to seek out first if you can't resolve things on your own, right? That should always be the first step, and hopefully you don't get there. If you do, take a look at mediation, where you could have impartial participation by a mediator that can hopefully help you resolve the issues, and can actually give a little bit of insight of, if you did go to trial, how would you fare? This would be a good way for you to both resolve your claims without spending $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on attorney's fees. After mediation, you might have voluntary arbitration, and you should be looking for these terms once again in your contract, because you might be agreeing at the outset to mediation if there is a dispute, or you might be agreeing to arbitration if there is a dispute, and you might be agreeing to what we also call jurisdictions on where that arbitration takes place. If you're in Port Angeles and you're agreeing to Tacoma, where you're going to be paying for an attorney in the Tacoma area or someone on the peninsula to travel there. These are all things that you should be keeping in mind, that how big is your company when you're agreeing to arbitration, and is a GC going to have power over you to drag things out or pay for more attorney costs when you really can't take on that additional burden. And arbitration is basically when an independent judge or someone that was formerly a judge would basically come in and arbitrate and come out to a decision that you both are agreeing to in advance, instead of going through a full civil process to hopefully reduce in those costs. We talked a little bit about liens earlier through that question, and bond claims. Now, on public work jobs, we know that you can't actually place a lien against public infrastructure projects that are federally funded. And most state projects have what we call Little Miller Acts, where you still can't place a lien. And that's where we require, or that's where GCs and primes are required to have bonding, and you'd make a claim against those bonds to help you recover, whatever you needed there, and potentially get your own bond, as you grow as a company. If it's a non-public works project, you might be taking a what we would call a mechanics lien against, if you're building a home, you would try and place a lien against that collateral of whatever you're building. Leslie, I want to make sure that we have a couple minutes for questions. If there's anything that I didn't cover.
Well, yeah, we do have just a couple minutes. So we'll open up the floor for anybody to jump in with any questions. And if we don't have any questions, just want to remind everyone that this presentation is available in our digital Dropbox. I know that Andrew posted the link on there for everyone. And, you can reach out to Graham if you have any particular questions that you want to do, not in a big group. And I see that Andrew's hand is up. So Andrew, go ahead.
Just wondering if we covered stop work provisions to Teresa's satisfaction. Did that?
Yeah, I don't think I got to that slide, or did I skip over that, Teresa? Did you see the language on one of the slides already in here?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Stop. I'm hoping I can find this. And actually, let's see here. Teresa, if we could set up a call, and I'll find that exact language in there too. But generally speaking, that, if you don't have a specific example, that stopgap provision might be something that when you're talking about notice or making a claim, that stopgap provision would allow for time for the sub to correct any of those issues, or make sure that you've got adequate time in that process to resolve any of those issues. But if you want to, let me go ahead and get your email, if you can share that with Andrew, and I can email you directly, and we can talk about that. I'm sorry, I may have pulled it out of my slide, out of my presentation. Geezer?
Hey, I have another question on the RCW section regarding contracts and contractors. Is there a specific section you can direct me to for good information about how to avoid any kind of pitfalls legally?
So I wouldn't say the RCWs aren't going to give you a good idea of pitfalls to avoid, because those are technical. The RCWs are technical laws, and those are default provisions if your contract doesn't already speak to it. So the contract that you're agreeing to, what you're reading, is going to power over the RCWs that could currently be there. And absent specific terms, you're going to have those RCWs as defaults. But what I think you're looking for is, how do you avoid some pitfalls in this process? And that's kind of, this presentation is one way to come back as a reference point to avoid pitfalls on, these are the most important things and the most common issues that where businesses have pitfalls, where they run into problems with the prime. But I think I might have another document that I could also send you in an email.
Well, I know that we're required to send notice to owner, notice to customer, depending on the job that we're doing. And I know of a contractor that didn't do that and got into a dispute with a customer, and he was forced to pay a $500 fine because he didn't send those notices. He was unaware of them, but he found out the hard way when he got fined $500.
Well, that could be once again, if it's not already spoken to in the contract, then absent some of those terms, then you would go to the default provisions in the RCW. For example, and there might be some other terms that there's limitations on how much you can charge for interest. So in your contract, if you're trying to charge 15%, the RCWs are going to potentially limit that, right? If there's an actual dispute. But generally, if there's for example, that interest rate that's set that is within the guidelines of the RCW, then that would apply of what's stated in the contract, and you wouldn't go to the RCWs.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you, Geezer, for your questions and everybody else that jumped in there. And special thanks to Graham. He's like our go-to guy on the Olympic Peninsula for a lot of different things, a tremendous resource for Clallam County. And we just want to thank him. And we'll take a real short break here, maybe 1 minute or so, and we'll queue up our next speakers. And so we'll have Vanner Construction Management here with Larry Bork and Craig Fulton. So we'll just take a real quick intermission and we'll let them share their screens. I believe Andrew has already assigned the co-host to you. This session is everybody's favorite on estimating and bidding process. And today we have Larry Bork here and Craig Fulton, and all of their materials are available in our digital drop, including their very comprehensive resumes. But in a nutshell, Larry Bork has 25 years with Baugh Construction, 15 years Lease Crutcher Lewis, 5 years with Venner, and he's an instructor of construction estimating at the University of Washington. Craig Fulton spent 27 years with the Navy Civil Engineer Corps and 5 years as Director of Public Works for the City of Port Angeles and 3 years for Vanner Construction Management. Their website is vanner.com, VANIR.com. And today's presentation will be providing an overview of types of construction contracts, how to develop an accurate estimate for these contracts, and how to put together a bid. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Larry and Craig. And so the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Leslie, very much. Good morning, everyone. And we appreciate the opportunity to be back again. We were here last year, and hopefully that was useful for everyone that was here, and looking forward to today's conversation today. Can you all see the slides? Is everybody good? Can you see them? Okay, good.
Yeah,
So you don't need to look at those two anymore. Leslie gave you a little bit of a rundown on who we are, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on these slides. Baugh is a little bit of a misnomer now. It's now Skanska Construction, not Baugh, but it was Baugh for when I was there, and I think Skanska bought out the company back in the year 2000. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. You heard about Craig. Craig is the manager of our Port Angeles regional office, and his focus is on the peninsula opportunities. So any questions that you might have with respect to opportunities over there will be directed to Craig, and he'll have an opportunity to chat with you a little bit about that at the end of the presentation. What are we going to do today? I'm going to walk you through more on the estimating side, the process of putting an estimate together and gathering information, and then also a bit on markups and general conditions. I'll tell you right now that the focus of my presentation is generally from a commercial contractor's perspective. I don't know where all of you work or what kind of firms you represent, but hopefully the principles and the guidelines that we're going to talk about today will be helpful, regardless if you're a general contractor or a sub or material supplier, whoever that might be. But it is from the perspective of a commercial contractor, since that was my world for 40 years. And then Craig is going to talk to you for a few minutes about how to become involved with work on the peninsula. And I'm sure that he'll provide you some good opportunity and good information for that as well. So let's see here. So first of all, a little bit on delivery methods. When you're working on estimates, you're going to be confronted with a lot of different delivery methods in the business. Certainly the common one in the commercial construction is guaranteed maximum price. It's generally in the private sector, it's usually a negotiated agreement. And the number of estimates you're going to do are probably going to be more than one. You'll do one at every design phase, schematic design, design development, and construction document. So much more of a focus on estimating in the GMP. Same way with the design build. You're probably familiar with design build, where actually the architect works for the contractor, not for the owner. And there's advantages and disadvantages to that. We could spend another hour on that one, but we won't do that today. Certainly GCCM is a procurement method that was established by RCW back in the early 2000s to allow public entities like University of Washington or public schools, things like that, to hire contractors early and to get the benefit of contractor input during design and hopefully manage financial and schedule risk. So that's, again, more than one estimate on these three. The last one is the familiar design bid build. You get one shot at it. If you're low bidder, you're low bidder. If you're not, you're not. I always say you got to be low, but you got to be right. And a lot of times that is difficult to accomplish. So those are the four different kinds of delivery methods that maybe some or all of you have experienced. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And I will tell you that, as I do with my students at the UW, learning is helpful if you can ask questions and get reliable answers. So I encourage questions at any time. There'll be a couple of opportunities during the presentation to ask, but if you have any, just feel free to interrupt if it comes to mind, and be happy to try to answer those. So what is estimating? You can see there, you've got, you roll the dice, you throw a dart at a dartboard. Who knows? Is that a Ouija board? It's sort of like a Ouija board, I guess. There's a lot of different ways to look at estimating, but I like to look at it this way: the process of determining the cost of performing a work task based on the information available. And a lot of the times, the information available is not always complete, especially in the first three procurement methods that I talked to you about. A lot of times, if you're trying to put an estimate together from a schematic set of documents, it's not all there, believe me. So it can be a little bit of a crapshoot, but the important thing is that you need to be organized and all of that. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. So following up on that, you got to answer questions. What do I have? What do I have to estimate? We call that the scope of the work, regardless of what it is. How much or how many do I have of that scope? That really refers to the quantity survey, or the QTO sheet, the quantity takeoff. How much does each one of those cost? Well, that's unit price, and you're going to assign a labor cost and a material cost to every unit that you quantify. And then you add it all up and you recap it, and there you have an estimate. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what estimating is. So let's talk a little bit about preparing that estimate. As you know, you've all done estimating before for a variety of different work scopes and for the companies that you work for. It has a lot of moving parts, just a lot of things that you have to consider. I always say it has to be assembled with care and precision. You can't just throw the dart at the dartboard. You can't just roll the dice. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that happens today. And depending on the size of the job, you could spend 2 to 4 weeks on preparing an estimate, And so it's a big deal. It costs companies a lot of money to put an estimate together. I always said it's 30 to 50,000 bucks for a contractor to put together an estimate on a reasonably sized project. So you have to do it with care and precision, and you have to be careful in how you do it. So the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we bid or don't we bid? We have a lot of opportunities to bid projects. First of all, are we capable of doing the job? Does it fit our resources? Does it fit the kind of work that we do? Will our workload allow the resources to do the job? We may be really, really busy. I'm not sure that it's a good idea then to bid the job. I always say that contractors can go broke by having too much work. So you have to evaluate and answer that question for yourself. Quality or not of the competition. If you're bidding against good quality competition, then yeah, let's go for it. But you may not be. So you have to ask yourself that question as well. A courtesy bid to show interest and maintain an existing relationship. We all work with clients. We all hope to have repeat work with good clients. But there are times maybe when we don't have time to bid a job. So is it wise to just give them a courtesy bid to maintain the relationship? I ask the question, is there a risk here? Anybody have an idea what that risk might be by turning in a courtesy bid just to show interest or maintain that relationship?
Well, you're leaving yourself susceptible to a ballpark number, and you could be way off.
Mm-hmm.
And now you've been kind of established as that guy that overbid by way too much or unrealistic.
Yep, that's right. Hey, Geezer, did you have a thought?
Well, I just want to point out that you mentioned that it's very costly to give bids. And if you're giving a courtesy bid, you might be just spending a lot of money to give some valuable information to somebody that will never give you anything in return for it.
That's right. And I would suggest that perhaps if you're going to do a courtesy bid, you wouldn't put a lot of energy and effort into it. And that's where the risk comes, as someone else said. I think, if you have a good client that you work for and all of a sudden you turn in a bid that's really high or really low, the credibility drops a little bit. So I've never been one to do that, but I think we got to go into something like that with our eyes open.
I would suggest you give more of an estimate than a bid.
Sure, I would agree with that 100%. And then, are there bond requirements? You always have to understand if there are bond requirements or not. So what are the risks to consider when you are deciding to bid a job? First of all, the owner experience. Are they experienced or not? I always said we wanted to work for experienced clients. Inexperienced clients are the first one that can create some problems for you. Does the owner have financing? Certainly you don't want to enter into a project without evidence of financing, but something that you need to find out. Do they have a construction manager on the job? Who is it? An architect or a consultant like us to represent the interests of the owner? And does that firm have a behavior history one way or the other? I think it's important to know if you can find out. The quality of the documents, a big deal. The quality of the documents are what drives RFIs, what drives change orders. So what do the documents look like? Certainly if you're on a GCCM or a negotiated project, the quality of the documents you can control because you can see them early on and you can watch them and you can manage those to the best you can. If it's a design bid build project, then you're stuck with what you get. And that could create problems for the team and for the client. So want to watch out for that. And then what's the architect's reputation for quality documents? Always want to ask yourself that question if you know. Schedule, is it realistic? If they give you a schedule, is it realistic or not? We're going to talk about general conditions in a little bit, but general conditions will reflect that schedule. And then certainly, as Graham was talking about, the liquidated damages clause, is there an LD clause or not? If there is, you need to be aware of that. You can't do anything about it because it's there. You have to understand what it is. $500 a day, $1,000. I've seen them up to $3,000, $4,000 a day. That gets your attention if you're 10 days late. you've got to understand that and make sure that you take that into consideration. At least you're aware of it. So payment terms. Again, what are the payment terms that are specified in the contract or in the general conditions? What are the retention terms like? There's a lot of different options for retainage. We always said hold retainage on our fee and our subs, but don't hold it on our labor and material. We can have a conversation about that if you'd like, but you need to understand what those retention terms are. And then the final payment, how long after completion are you going to get paid? Again, all these things go into the decision to bid the job or not. So if you decide to bid, and that's a lot of talk to whether or not you're going to bid a job or not, what's the plan to take it off? What's the plan to get it priced and be ready for bid day? And then that plan will include a schedule. How much time do you have? And your resources. Who's going to do what? If you have nobody to bid the job, then you probably shouldn't do it. And if you got to bid a complicated job and you only have a week, well, then that's another consideration. So I always want to understand whether or not you have the time and the personnel to bid a project. And there's our good friends here. You could do your estimate this way. I hope we don't, but went from 3 million to 911 bucks. So who knows how that works, but anyway, or you could be prepared. And I guess I'm an advocate for being prepared. Proper presentation prevents poor performance. The reason why is that bad things can happen to you if you're not organized and you're not prepared. So we're going to walk through the process now. I apologize for the lengthy introduction to this, but I think it's important that you understand that estimating is not just quantifying materials and pricing it. It's also a strategy for if and when it's in your best interest to prepare an estimate. So that's why I go through that. So you have 3 buckets to an estimate structure that I like to talk about. The one is direct cost. Direct costs will include labor, materials, subcontractors, and equipment. It's the cost to perform the work, whatever that might be. Might be a sheetrocker, then it's metal studs and tape and mud and stuff, or dirt guy. I see there's somebody here from Eden Excavating, Teresa, I believe. So her scope of work is different than a contractor's scope of work. Or she would be a subcontractor to a general contractor. You would have indirect costs. Those are the general conditions, or the GCs as we call them. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then the markups. You have your cost, you have your general conditions. Now, how do you mark it up and what are those markups consist of? And we'll have a few minutes to discuss those as well. So, we need to be organized. This is just a list of how do we get organized for a bid. You got to advertise it. You got to make sure there's a bid bond. We'll talk about a bid bond in a little bit. You got to prepare the bid form. You got to understand insurance requirements, the QTOs for self-perform work. If you're a contractor, you're going to have concrete, miscellaneous steel, doors and hardware, accessories, etc. You have to quantify those and price them yourself because you're going to do that work. You're going to have to prepare a preliminary schedule because the general conditions will be informed by your schedule. You're going to have to set up bid day folders, have a bid day computer. All these things, first run estimate, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. You got to set up a bid room and get organized, solicit personnel to take phone bids, take those bids and post them and turn them in. You turn a bid in. How many of you have ever been late to turn a bid in? I was late one time on about a $20 million job. I was late by 3 minutes.
I was just going to say, late doesn't tend to fly very well. If you get more than about 10 minutes out, they've just shut it down and you're out.
No, they took my bid and they put it in the trash can because we were late. And then you have to go back to your office and tell them what happened. Now, it wasn't my fault necessarily, but I was the bid runner. So lots of horror stories to talk about for being late for bids. So you don't want to be late. And if you're not organized and you're not ready to go, then you could be late. So anyway, just don't be late. So here's kind of a graphic of the process from collecting and requesting information all the way to the final bid. And we'll go through a short summary of each one of these to make sure that you understand, or if you have any questions. First of all, you're going to get an invitation to bid. You're going to have to read that carefully. You're going to have to understand how many copies you need to submit. Alternates in unit prices. If you have alternates in unit prices, then as I tell my students, you have to have a QTO and recaps that categorize and separate all of that work, because it has to be an alternate apart from your base bid or a unit price. So you have to know what those are so you can behave accordingly when you're doing quantity survey. Is a bid bond required? Does everybody know what the bid bond does? Right, everybody knows what the bid bond is, okay. And then is there a contract form attached? Is it the AIA 201? No, that's the GCs, the 111, whatever it is, you know, you need to understand what that is. Are there any requirements? Do you have to sign it and turn it in with your bid? Sometimes you do, because you have to agree to the contract form. Well, okay, you just have to know that. It's not I wouldn't ever advocate doing that, but if you have to know you have to do it. The team will consist of a chief estimator. I'm sure you have estimators that focus on this work in your firm, who's going to manage the effort, who's going to price it. He's one that's in charge. The staff, the estimating staff, is probably going to work on QTOs, the quantity takeoffs for your self-performed work. Superintendent, key guy, probably the most important guy on your crew is the superintendent, not only from the work performance aspect, but also he's the one that's going to create the schedule. And probably we'll look at productivity rates if your firm estimates with productivity rates rather than unit prices. I teach productivity rates myself. I think that's the more consistent way to do it, but there's a lot of different ways to price labor. And then you probably have one or two folks, depending on the size of the work, that's going to chase subs for you. Subs will be about 60 or 70% of your bid. So you have to make sure that it's well advertised. And what subs are you going to focus on? And are you going to have any ROM estimates for all these subcontract numbers that you're going to get in? We'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. You need sufficient coverage. You know, if you have a huge job and you have one electrical bid, you don't have sufficient coverage. So you want to make sure that that coverage is adequate so that you can minimize that risk as much as possible. So you're going to collect all the information that you got. Where's that going to, is there a raised hand, Andrew? Am I?
Yeah, I just, on that last slide, you're mentioning the percentage of work for subs.
Yeah.
There's a thing with the feds where certain contracts will require that the general do a certain percentage of the work. I just wanted to point out that there's a very specific need in some of these requirements. And if they have one of those things where the general has to perform 90% of the work, then you have to be aware of that. And everybody should be crossing their T's, dotting their I's, and just verifying what the numbers are expected to be before they go out and trying to get subs to do everything involved.
Exactly. You know, a contractor likes subcontractors because then they can shed risk, you know, because the biggest risk for a contractor is direct labor. And if they can minimize that, then that's good for them. In the GCCM world, you're only allowed to self-perform 30%, I think. And then they won't let you self-perform anymore. So yeah, there's a variety of different ways to do that, Andrew, but I appreciate that observation. That's good. So you got plans, you got specs, soils report, really important if you're a general contractor to know what's in that soils report. All the addenda, pre-site visits, bid requirements, all of that, you have to get all that information. And then you have to get into the nuts and bolts. And this is the good old QTO sheet. This is something that I use. I use this in my working life, and I use it in my teaching life to accurately quantify the material that you have. Of course, this is a concrete takeoff for a job in Marysville, but it could be a sheetrock takeoff for a job in Olympia. I mean, for me, it's the process that you go through and the worksheet that you're using in order to keep yourself organized. So labor isn't a big deal for contractors, whether you're a sub or whether you're a general. It's your biggest risk. You know, if you overrun your labor, nobody's going to pay you for it unless you get a change order, and that's not likely unless it's entitled. So you need to be really careful with your labor, and that's why a quantity survey is very, very important to do it accurately. And then the next step is the pricing recap. If you see here, you have, 3,282 square feet of form. Well, then if you go to the spread footings down at the below, you see that number right there, form footings 3,282. In this particular case, we're estimating by unit man hours and estimating by wage rate and material costs. So it's kind of a sequential thing. You go from the QTO to the pricing recap for every piece of self-perform work that you think you're going to have. You always have to quantify it first and then go to the pricing recap. And you're going to price it from RS means, a database, however you price your work. But all of that has to be taken into consideration. The project summary schedule should be done by the superintendent, of course, and we'll inform the GCs. It will also provide input to subcontractors. If a sub asks you, when are you going to start electrical rough-in, or when are you going to start, when do I need to be there to paint, and how long do you anticipate? Well, that's something that you can give them. So the preliminary schedule is really important to have up front if you can, when you bid a job. Now you're getting into that 50, 60, 70% of the work, which is the subcontractor and supplier bids. I'm going to show you forms today. Forms are what we used, what I teach. I'm sure you have different forms. They probably don't look like that, but they might. But this is a subcontractor supplier bid form that you're going to get a bid from a subcontractor or a supplier from. You're going to write it down. We'll show you how to fill that out in a minute. And then you're going to have a recap sheet or a bid sheet that allows you to post all of your bids for certain work scopes on one sheet of paper. All right. And so the way that works for us, and I think it's important to do it somewhat this way, is here's the bid that's filled out. The bid form that you saw a couple slides ago, it's filled out completely. If you're having folks in your office take bids from subs or suppliers, this is how I would recommend that you do it. You fill it out completely. You have spec sections, of course, the price. I always say I'm interested in what you have. I'm really interested in what you don't have, because exclusions can jump up and bite you. So ask them what they don't have, write it down. Any alternates in unit prices? Is it furnish only or furnish and install? Where's the FOB? Free on board. Was that FOB job site, FOB warehouse? Where is it? And then you deliver that to the bid room as soon as you can. Then you put that on that yellow sheet that I just showed you. Okay. And here you can see two columns. This is for drywall. The first column, you can see I did this when I worked at Lease Crutcher Lewis. This says drywall, and we had estimated that at $175,000. And we circled that number because that number goes into our preliminary estimate. We always, at the end of the day or the day before bid day, we always had an estimate done, completed, with marked up and everything. So if nothing else happened, we could turn that in because it had all the scope in it. And those subcontracts that we didn't have, we use that number that's circled right there. Now, when we get bids in, now we start to adjust it up or down, depending on what that number is. And you can see our good friend Roger at F&A Drywall bid $166,330. All right, well, these are what $9,000 less than what we had used. So you can cross out the Lewis number and circle the Roger number, and now you can adjust it. And now you're current with what you have for a drywall at this particular time. You may not want to adjust that every time you get a bid in, but occasionally you need to do that. So when you turn a bid in, you have all the real numbers from subcontractors rather than your number, which you would like to think is accurate, but probably isn't as accurate as you need to be. So you got one recap for each work scope. You got one of those for drywall, one for paint, one for sewer pipe, one for utilities, one for landscape, whatever it might be, if you're a contractor. If you're a sheetrocker, you might have one for drywall supply, one for studs, one for whatever. You know, there's all sorts of different options and work scopes that go along with each one of your bids. So you update it as different bids come in. It's organized and sequential. This is bid number 17. There are 16 ahead of it, and you keep that in order. And then it's managed by a few people. You don't want everybody in the middle of this. You only want one or two people that are running this sheet. All right. And then at the end of the day, this is your final bid or your final estimate. And as you can see, all the administrative expense have already been calculated and inserted in the form. In this particular case, it's a very simple example of a cast in place concrete with a detention vault and some tilt up concrete, slab on metal deck and structural steel. That's all of our self-performed work that we've already done. We've priced it and we've put it onto a bid sheet like this. And that we've put in we fill out our subcontract box right there, the 4,332,000. That's the total of all of those yellow sheets that I showed you a few minutes ago. We've put our labor burden in. We've marked it up with a fee. We've got our taxes and insurance in there. And the yellow box is what you change. You change the yellow box based on the adjustments that you make. You go from the Lewis drywall number to Rogers drywall number. Okay, so that's how that works. Okay, so it goes from the QTO sheet to the recap sheet to the bid sheet to this sheet. Okay, and it's very sequential. And you know, timing is a lot in this. You know, you need to be here on the day before your bid. If your bid is at 2 o'clock on Tuesday, which is when we used to bid jobs, this sheet is filled out in its entirety before you go home on Monday night. And then the next day, all you're doing is managing sub bids as they come in. And then you got to follow up with all sorts of things. You're going to have estimating checklists you got to go through. If you are successful, you want to debrief. If you're unsuccessful, you want to debrief. We call that a process QC check, and then maintain all your files for both bids, successful or not, just so you can refer to them in the future. So, that's a lot of work, a lot of stuff in about what 20 minutes or so. Any questions so far? We got a little ways to go. But any questions on what I just went through? I know it's a lot of information. You know, I teach this in 2 hours at the UW, and so I apologize for the quick nature of this. Yeah, Geezer, what do you got?
Well, when you are unsuccessful, how do you do your comparison to adjust in the future?
Well, it depends on how unsuccessful you are. If you're in the middle of the pack, you know, you're a couple % off, you know, maybe that's a function of the competition, maybe it's a function of the market. I think it's important to go through and check everything to make sure you haven't made a mistake. If you left something out, or you go back and say, oh man, I missed this sub, and the sub wouldn't have got me there, but he would have got me closer, then you have to understand that and kind of redo everything so that you can accurately reflect your bid based on the mistakes that you may have made. Okay. Now, you know, generally you can't control the subs because they're going to be what they're going to be. But what you can control is your labor. You can control your productivity rate. You can certainly control your fee. If you went in at a 5% fee and you think, oh geez, maybe I'll go in at 4 next time. You know, it's pretty subjective, but you know, the key there is to understand why, if you can, and then react from there, I would say. Anything else? Any other questions on what we've talked about?
I have one more.
Yeah.
the breakdown from the subs, when you're getting their estimates, I'm noticing that you don't have any details behind materials versus labor versus any of their markups. Is it just assumed that they're treating you like you're treating the bid and they're just giving you the final number? Like, is it ever a thing where you go and negotiate with the sub to try and see if they could get a different vendor for their parts, just to try and get some numbers to go down a little bit?
Well, Andrew, it's this is another class that I teach called ethics, and I'm not suggesting that you're suggesting that we be unethical, but the bid you get, like this one right here, the 166 from F&B Drywall, they're not going to break it down for you in terms of labor and material unless you ask them to. And it's unusual that you would get a subcontracting bid for anything with labor and material unless you're looking for unit prices or something like that. And the minute you start to ask questions about, well, can you lower your bid, is you start to wander into this ethical conversation about, am I giving him an opportunity that I'm not giving someone else? And if you start giving everybody that opportunity, then that's not a good thing. I think to answer your question, you're probably not going to get a labor material breakdown. If you decide that F&B Drywall is going to do the work for you and you are low bidder, then you can have those conversations with them for whatever reason. But prior to knowing, and especially if you're low and you're trying to get somebody to reduce their price, then I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. If you're not low, well, you're not low. I don't know that doing this would allow you to get low, but it's a slippery slope at best when you start to ask folks to lower their price.
Yeah, I bring that up just as an example. I was working as a screw and hardware salesman, and a gentleman was trying to get a bid at Fairchild Air Force Base, and he kept trying to select. The Fairchild wanted a very specific shape and tensile strength to the screws for these hangers.
Mm-hmm.
And he kept trying to get things that would be good as substitutes.
Mm-hmm.
And Fairchild was leaning in very specifically. We need this exact part,
Mm-hmm.
which it ended up being $14,000 a box for 1,000 screws.
Holy
out of a custom manufacturer down in, I think it was Brazil.
Yeah.
To meet those specifications. And the contracting officer was interacting with this guy on a regular basis, and that's where it gets fuzzy. Is like the contracting officer specified you have to have these screws, period.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy himself was the low bid until that came in, and once they got picked as the recipient, then my estimate of $2,000 for hardware was way off. And so the whole thing became this troubled negotiation between Fairchild and the contractor, because the cost overrun on those screws was catastrophic. Fortunately, the contracting officer was very kind, open, and had a big budget, and the whole thing ended up working out. But suffice it to say, it was a headache. There were a lot of meetings.
Well, I'm sure there were, and the guy that was supplying the screws probably didn't get a substitution request into the designer to get that approved, so that he could reasonably provide his estimate using the cheaper screws, and not get into a big contest with the contracting officer. That's the right way to do it. What you never want in this business is, you all know, is surprises. Surprises are killers. And this was a surprise. Oh crap, I've got a $14,000 hole. Now what do I do? And that can be alleviated by certainly being organized and doing things the right way. But I understand your point. I've been down that road too. It's not fun. Geezer, you had something? You're muted.
Sorry about that. I was just going to point out something that you touched on, and that's why I shut off the microphone, and that would be what we call value engineering.
Oh, yes.
And what you were describing is some specific screws with specific tensile strength, et cetera. But to value engineer that and get it accepted, it's been my experience that once that's done, that information is given to everybody bidding so that it's a fair playing field.
Yeah, yep, exactly. And
It ended up being a guy on our side. It was the salesman who originally did the estimate for him. thought, oh, well, that's just a standard, this type of screw. I don't remember what it was. I know it was a number, I can't even remember. It was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But the guy who did the estimate for the contractor had just thought it was a standard out of the box normal thing. And everybody else had bid using we have to go to a very custom specification.
Sure.
But this guy won because he was so much lower than everybody else, when really it was
No
our
wonder.
salesman. Yeah, and our salesman screwed up and dropped the ball on everything. So he was removed from the project, and we had somebody else take that over. And lo and behold, the whole thing kind of went smoothly after that.
Yeah, so from a client, when I worked with the Navy as a client standpoint, whenever I see a low bid that is markedly different than everybody else, red flags go up. We start asking questions. There was a project where, they had to install 2 very, very expensive boilers. Guy got the low bid. After he got the bid and, was a low bid, he realized he only estimated 1 boiler. And he could prove it. He had all the documentation and started discussions with the contracting officer and was able to get out of it. And, that's why you have your bid bonds and so forth. But from a client standpoint, if there's one, the low bid is way off from everybody else, I start asking a lot of questions.
Yep. Agreed. Good comment, Craig. Anything else? Okay, let's talk about general conditions. We call those indirect costs. And costs that are not attributable to specific work activities. Major components are job staff and support, project managers, project engineers, superintendent, anybody salaried that you're going to have on your job site that sits in the job trailer and manages the work for you out there. Equipment and supplies, temporary construction, Santa cans, temporary railings, temporary power, stuff like that. And office equipment and supplies. Every one of you does GCs differently. Contractors, they have huge general condition budgets, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a month, crazy numbers. But they have big staffs, they have lots of equipment. They just, so I won't go into a lot of conversation on general conditions. The key is they're generally a function of time. Okay. So that's why it's important to have that preliminary schedule to make sure that if I have a 17-month job, my general conditions are for 17 months. You don't want to set your GCs for 14 and end up having a 20-month schedule. That's not good. So there's a lot of different components in general conditions. We won't, I could lecture you for 2 hours on GCs, but I won't. If you have a tower crane or a man and material hoist on your job, these can be in general conditions. More than likely the man hoist will be, the tower crane will not be. It'll be in the work scopes. Because it supports the concrete and some closure, things like that, and then it comes down. So, and as I tell my students, the general conditions are the most subjective to quantify and get your arms around. It's not like taking off concrete. It's not like counting footings that are 3 by 5 by 2 feet deep, and that's easy to do. It's how long am I going to need this? How many PEs am I going to need? How many lineal feet of temporary handrail do I need? What's it look like? How many Santa cans do I need? 1 per 10, 1 for 15, so it's a harder thing to categorize. I suggest to them, in their beginning class, I tell them use 8% of construction costs. That's what I tell them on a commercial job. But then after the schematic design is done, now you have to get into the detail. You have to understand how to price general conditions. So I give that to you as something that's really, really important. Depending on who you are and what kind of work you do, your GCs will look different than probably this does. But you still have them, and it's still important for you to get out ahead of the game and have somebody look at this independently of everything else that everybody's doing, and come up with a reasonable number for GCs. Markups. Let's talk quickly about markups. You have labor burden, bonds, liability, et cetera, et cetera. We'll go through each one of these. Labor burden. We all know what labor burden is: labor tax, Medicare and Social Security, FICA, FUTA, SUTA, workman's comp, union dues. All of that has to be added on to the labor dollars. Okay. In the commercial contracting world, 35% for salaried personnel, 54% for craft trades. And then, I mean, iron workers right now are 71%. You know, for a union iron worker gets 71 cents on every dollar that he makes, that you have to account for. So the labor burden is a big deal, and you have to be able to understand your crews, who you have on your project. You know, if it's a prevailing wage or not, you know, a lot of those factors into the labor burden calculation, but it needs to be there, and you can't forget it. Bonds, we talked a lot about bonds. The performance in the payment bond guarantees the contractor's performance and guarantees the payment obligations. You may or may not have to provide a performance bond or a bond in general. If the lender requires you to do that, then you have to do it, regardless if you need to or not. If you're working for a public agency, you're probably going to have to provide a performance and payment bond. The rates vary depending on the size of the job. Bonding state sales tax is interesting. I don't know how many of you bond the sales tax, but let's say you have a $10 million job and you're asked to provide a performance bond, a performance and payment bond for that work. I will tell you that you need to base your bond premium on $11 million, not 10. Why is that? Because the bond guarantees that you're going to pay your obligations. And in the state of Washington, the obligation to pay sales tax to the state is on the contractor, not on the owner. The owner pays the contractor sales tax as a part of each pay application for payment, but the legal obligation to pay the state of Washington is with the contractor. So if you have to bond it, you have to make sure that you're guaranteed that you're going to pay your obligation. So I always tell my kids, you know, you add sales tax onto your contract amount, now calculate your bond premium on that number. Okay. The bid bond, we all know what the bid bond is. There's no charge for that. Guarantees the low bid against default. Just make sure you have it if you have to have a bid bond. And you turn in a bid and the bid bond isn't in the envelope. Remember that example I told you about being late at the start of the lecture? It's not a lecture, I'm sorry. I'm not lecturing, I'm talking to you. They'll throw it away too if you don't have a bid bond. And there's no cost for it. It's just somebody didn't do what they were supposed to do. So if you need one, make sure you have it in that envelope. The B&O tax is, you know, everybody pays B&O tax in the state. It's 0.471. In every city that you're in, not where you're located, but where the job is, it can vary. In Seattle, it's 215, I think. In Bellevue, it's 0.1. Burien is 0. I mean, you have to check the city rate on the B&O tax. The liability insurance is every contractor will have PL and PD, personal liability and property damage that insures you. And that, you know, it's 1%, 1.5%, depending on who you are and what your insurance rates are, what your EMR is on your safety. And builder's risk, you may or may not be asked to provide builder's risk insurance. Builder's risk insurance is the insurance for the completed portion of the uncompleted project. That's what builder's risk is. And it insures the owner, not the contractor. It insures the owner. Contractors can generally get it cheaper than owners can, but you have to understand that if you need to provide builder's risk insurance, you need to have that in there, all right, as an add-on. SDI, new to the industry. I don't know if any of you have come across SDI, subcontractor default insurance. General contractors are using this a lot. It requires that all subs participate on a blanket insurance policy. It takes the place of a bond. And if you you qualify based on your financial health. And if you can't qualify to be a part of the blanket SDI policy with all the rest of the subs, then you have to provide the performance and payment bond. And if you can't do that, then you can't be a part of the team. So big deal. You got to watch that if you're bidding and you see SDI, that's what that means. And then the sales tax, we don't usually include that in an estimate. It's usually not in a contract in the state of Washington. It's always separate. We're running out of time. Leslie, I see you came back on. I'm running out of time. I'm sorry. How much time do we have, by the way? Just help me with that a little bit. You're muted.
Okay. I'm back. I know that we have just a few more slides to go.
Yep.
And I'm thoroughly enjoying your overview of all of this. And if anybody needs to drop out, I think that's okay. But I think that you're good to go for the rest of your slides.
Okay, we'll rush through these as quick as we can. Fee is certainly everybody wants to make money, so this is where the make money part is. It depends on a lot of things: backlog, market conditions. The busy market, higher fee; down market, lower fee. Small backlog, lower fee. But everybody has to decide based on the size of the job, their company. But it is there. Fee components, overhead and profit. Sometimes it's a function of direct labor. Contractors always looked at direct labor. How much direct labor do I have? And that's going to influence the fee percentage that I put on. It usually will pay for a bonus pool, if any, profit sharing, if any, if you're an ESOP company, employee stock ownership plan. That'll come out of the fee as well. For general contractors, 3 to 5%-ish. Back in 2008 and 9 and 10, I remember bidding jobs at Lewis with 0 fee. No fee. Why? Because we need to keep our people busy. Only once did I see negative fee. But but you're living in a tough world then when you're bidding jobs at no fee. I mean 3% or 5%. Would you risk $100 million for 5%? Oh boy, it's a tough business. So that's why everything that we've talked about today is so very, very important, because it is a difficult business and your return is not much from a risk standpoint. So okay, so then the last thing I think is contingencies. Contingencies come into play on the negotiated work, the negotiated GMP, the GCCM, and the design build market. That's where contingencies will come in. Design bid build market, no contingencies. You can't afford to have contingencies in because you can't be low bidder if you put a contingency in. So you can't have those. Generally, you're going to have different kinds of contingencies for different things. Let's talk quickly about design contingency. Is a contingency that included in early estimates to account for the unknown design that you don't know that's what's coming. You know something's coming, but you don't know what it is. So you put in a percentage called design contingency. We usually say 7 to 10% at schematic, 5% at DD, and 0 at CDs, because you know everything that you need to know. Estimated contingency is to allow in your estimate to allow for estimating errors. It's a negotiated thing with your owner, and it can be anywhere from 1 to 2%. Construction and buyout contingency. Construction contingency is used for things that come up that beyond the contractor's control that he can use with permission from the owner to use. The only thing that you need to remember here is that if you don't use it, you give it to the owner. You give it back to the owner. You've probably heard of guaranteed maximum price with shared savings clauses, where if you have savings, you're going to share those, majority to the owner, some to the contractor. If you have a contingency, a construction contingency in your estimate, and you don't use it, then you have to give that back to the owner 100% prior to determining savings, which you'll share. So, and again, we can go on and on and on about stuff like this, but I want to be respectful of your time. Buyout contingency is just what it says. You bid this job, you get that sheet all done, and now you're going to go out and you have to buy it out. What does buyout mean? Buyout means that I'm going to go and I'm going to execute contracts with my subs and my suppliers. Now back to maybe what Andrew was talking about a little while ago. Now you can start to ask questions about what do you have in, what do you have out. If you're talking to the sheetrocker and the sheetrocker says, well, I included the installation of the hollow metal frames. Oh, really? Well, I included those in my self-perform work. That's a buyout, okay? So if I want you to do it, Mr. Sheetrocker, probably I do, because then I shed my labor risk. Then I've bought out, I don't need to use the money that I have in my estimate, my self-performed estimate, to install hollow metal frames. Or I may get a sub bid to install doors and hardware. It's cheaper than my bid to self-perform it. Well, then that's buyout. So you accumulate buyout savings. You can also borrow from buyout savings if you have a hole somewhere too. So that's what buyout contingency is. Escalation, the cloudy crystal ball. If you bid a job today and you're going to start it a year from now, how much is it going to cost me a year from now to build if I'm estimating it at today's dollars? That's a tough one. I say right now it's in the 4-ish range annually. Generally, normally it should be 3 to 4% a year, okay, for escalation. But the current market right now is crazy. You've read about it. You've probably experienced it. You know, I can't get this. I can't get millwork, or price of lumber just went up 40% in a week. You know, how do you control that? I've seen numbers 8 to 10% on top of the 4. So it's a big deal. So if you're in a job, you're working with a client and you have to put escalation on, you need to be very, very careful about what you say and how you communicate that with respect to escalation. I usually put it in 2 buckets. One is the normal escalation, standard, in the 3 to 4% range, and then unexpected escalation due to supply chain issues or whatever it might be. Now that's a conversation you can have with your client. Okay, they will expect you to know the 3 to 4% because you're the expert, you're the contractor. The other part, nobody, the crystal ball becomes dark at that point because you just don't know. Wow, we made it. Do you have any questions now about what we've talked about since the last time we had asked for questions?
Well,
Okay.
I don't see any questions. I did read ahead and I know what's on your last slide.
That's what's on the last
And I
slide.
think that this is really a critical resource for all of our participants today. And, so maybe if Larry and Craig can talk about, the things that you're doing on the peninsula, current or future projects that are coming up there.
This is
Or
Craig's
is
slide,
this your
so I'll let
laundry
him
list
talk.
right
Yep.
here?
Yeah, I can jump into
Okay.
this slide and what we're doing. So just background, Vanner is a construction management firm. We don't build things and we don't design things. We assist the client in executing their projects from concept to completion, turnover, and commissioning. That's what we do. So we work with design consultants, engineering consultants, contractors, and the client to get the project done. So what Larry's gone through today is, how to put the bid together, and everybody's thinking, well, the low bid wins the job, and everybody's got the same plans, everybody knows the same thing, so everybody's on the same playing field. Well, I don't fully agree with that. There are ways you can get an edge, and that's what I want to talk about today. First bullet, network. Know people, know organizations, know what they're doing. Let me jump down to the third bullet. Knowing that a project is coming up will give you an edge. You can start exploring, you can start talking about it, understanding the project that's coming up. Now, how do you know when a project is coming up? Join North Peninsula Building Association. If you're not part of NPBA and you're working on the peninsula, join, become active. Lots of conversations there on meeting contractors, meeting subcontractors, meeting vendors, suppliers. That's where you can really gain an edge. Economic Development Council, become members, get active all throughout the pandemic. Every Wednesday morning, they've been having Zoom conversations. covering all sorts of subjects, all sorts of clients. They talk about insurance, they talk about bonding, they talk about COVID funding, wealth of information with the EDC. Get involved. Chamber of Commerce, again, you learn about who's developing what, who's getting funding. And then the Port Angeles Business Association, again, meeting, networking, finding out what's happening. The fourth bullet, many communities, instead of waiting to find out, you know, by reading the DJC or some of these business publications on an RFP coming out, sign up for automatic announcements. I get automatic announcements from the city of Port Angeles. I get them from the city of Bremerton. And guess what? I get announcements when they're going out for design services on a project. What does that tell me? It tells me a project's coming up. It tells me they've got funding. And I can start talking with that municipality on when they might go to construction. So I now can track projects, big projects, and be ready and know in advance that they're coming out, rather than waiting to the last minute and find an RFP and then have to jump on the estimating process then. If you're a supplier or subcontractor, and we just went out with a project in the last week. The client and the construction management firm shouldn't have any issues. You know, go to the client or the construction management firm and says, who's bidding on this project? There's, you know, when an RFP comes out, we develop a list of anybody who wants the RFP, we develop that list. In that list, you're going to find who the contractors are going to be. If you're a supplier or subcontractor, get that list, and then you can start discussions with the prime contractors and try and get into that into their estimating process if they and get involved in the project that way. That jumps back to bullet. If you're a small subcontractor, get to know the large prime contractors. Yes, they're going to go on price, but a lot of clients now, and that's what we're working on a project right now, we're going to work on best value. We're not necessarily going to award on the low price. So the price will be a percentage of our evaluation factors, but we want to know about your experience, your past history. Can you do the project? Any good, we want a contractor who we know can perform on time with a quality that we're looking for. So developing that experience and reputation so you can be on board with best value projects is a good thing. The last bullet, follow the money. If you see clients who have levies approved for school projects, have bonds approved for school projects, have federal authorizations or state authorizations for funding, you know there's going to be a construction project following sometime in the future. Port Angeles School District has a major levy construction that was approved. And they'll be working that over the next couple of years. Squim School District also has levy renovations, multiple renovation projects over the next 6 years. Olympic Medical Center is always looking to expand. They put a number of projects on hold because of Medicare disbursement. And if you were listening to EDC, you'd know all about that because they've talked about OMC and Medicare and how it's affected their projects. Squim has a lot of money for infrastructure expansion. Get on their automatic distribution list. And then if you look at city council minutes, board agendas like OMC or school districts, you can find where they're talking about their 5-year capital development plan. Get their capital development plan. I think some of the clients earlier in the week have listed their capital development plans, and you can see what's happening in the next 12 months, 24 months, over the next 5 years, and stay abreast of those projects. Get big up, understand what they want to do, where they want to do it, when they want to do it. And so you're not caught on back, on your back foot when the RFP finally comes out, and then have to react. Be proactive. For what projects we're executing right now, Vanner's involved in construction management for the Port Angeles Waterfront Center down on the waterfront. We are about 8% complete on a new school for the Quileute tribe out in La Push. We're helping Platypus through the design process right now for a new maintenance building. We assisted the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe through the whole permitting process for the downtown hotel. They just got their substantial shoreline substantial development permit, which allows them to really move forward quickly on that one. We're now working with North Olympic Healthcare Network, renovating Edna's Place into a primary clinic. Really excited about that because the community desperately needs primary care services here on the peninsula. And we're working with, at the airport, building a new hangar, a 4-bay hangar to expand airplane storage facilities out there. And then Ray Street, the city of Port Angeles Ray Street project, as soon as design is done on that, we'll be kicking off construction management for that project. So that was a quick snapshot of what we're doing here on the peninsula. Again, Port Angeles School District has a major levy that they're going to have to execute for the middle school, and then Swim School District also has a levy for multiple facility and upgrade projects. With that,
Craig, is that all? It's so amazing to have a dynamic duo as Larry and Craig addressing, the things that are in the backyard of Clallam County. And, we so appreciate your expertise, your experience, your longevity, and overall knowledge that you shared today with our audience. Some of us are not in construction. I learned about construction through osmosis. My husband was in the trades for 50 years, and lots of changes, in the last 10 years. And not all the changes are good, things like the pandemic and supply chain issues, and then trying to address those in your numbers. That's a huge deal. So if there's any other questions, we'll open it up for a moment. And if we don't have any questions, we would like to thank Larry and Craig and Vanner Construction Management. You guys truly are a terrific capstone for this whole series that we've been doing. So we want to thank you very much for coming today. And we want to recognize the Economic Development Council, Northwest Small Business Transportation Resource Center, Kitsap Bank, and the North Peninsula Building Association. And before we close, I think Colleen is still here, and we'll turn it over to Colleen to say a few words in closing.
Hi there. Thank you
And-
so much. Yeah, sorry. Couldn't find that unmute button. We sure appreciate everybody's time, and it's just so important to our community in general. I've said over and over again that the biggest area of leakage for our county beyond Amazon is the fact that our local property tax dollars, sales tax dollars, et cetera, keep on going to companies in the I-5 corridor. And when you talk about improving an economy, the first thing is where's there a demand for something? And there's a growing demand in our communities, especially around the fish passage issues. There's going to be $1 billion spent in Clallam County just fixing those fish passages before 2030. And so we got to keep at least some small portion of that here locally instead of allowing that to leak to already thriving companies in the I-5 corridor. So, you know, whether it's flagging, safety, hydro seeding, whatever it is, and whether it's part of a vertical construction package, there's just so much that happens here on the peninsula. And I've watched for the last 12 years the Port of Port Angeles issue all these contracts to companies outside of our area. And it's just as honestly infuriated me over the years. So I'm so glad that you guys were able to join us and hope that we can grow your local share of these lucrative contracts in the future. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Colleen. And I see Lori had her hand up. So Lori, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to thank Craig and Larry and my connection with Kristen Helberg and being able to communicate with you guys and get you on board for these training sessions. I also noticed on the last slide, Craig, when it said network, we had planned to have a meet and greet with the primes and subcontractors, but due to the circumstances in our area with COVID increased cases, we decided to postpone that out maybe to the springtime. So I wanted to let everyone know on the call that we will communicate that with all of the primes in our areas and to all the subcontractors and local contractors here so that we can have that opportunity to get together, collaborate, and meet each other in this arena, in this sector where it's so important to learn about each individual business's as we grow in the local community that we live.
So thank you, Lori. I'd like to remind everyone, if you'd like to share your contact information in the chat, so that our participants can reach out to you. Feel free to go ahead and do that. We'll be on for just another moment, but if you have any questions, either as a participant or a presenter, you can always reach out to me or to Andrew from SBTRC, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. And for those of you that don't know, Washington PTAC is a member of a national organization funded by the Department of Defense. And our primary goal is to educate and inform small businesses all about contracting, local, state, federal contracting. We can answer a lot of questions for you. So feel free to reach out to me. And if you are not in Clallam County or on the Olympic Peninsula, we share our resources so we can connect you with, whomever that you need to talk to. So thank you all. And I think with that, we'll call it a day. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Clallam County, Colleen and Lori. It's been a pleasure working with everybody, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.